All right, so whereas in the last lesson we were looking at local implementations of using Git and version control, in this lesson we're going to talk about how you can create a remote repository. So a repository that's hosted on somebody else's server or somebody else's computer by using GitHub. Now, most people would have heard of GitHub, and certainly by now you would have used GitHub many times in order to grab the skeleton projects that we've provided for some of the tutorials and challenges. So if you haven't yet set up an account on GitHub, then this is the time to do it. So head over to github.com and simply fill out this quick form to create an account on GitHub. So it's completely free, and all you need to do is just confirm your email so that you can access it. Once you've done that, go ahead and sign in. So once you've signed in, you should be looking at this page, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a repository inside the browser-based GitHub. So if you navigate to this top right corner and click that plus arrow, then you can select New Repository. And I'm going to call my repository, same name, I guess we'll call it Story, and let's give it a description. Let's say my masterpiece. Now, by default, all repositories that you create on GitHub are public. That means that anyone can see all of the files inside your saved repository. So everything that you commit to your remote repository or to your GitHub repository will be public. So if you don't want that, then you can select private, which requires a subscription on GitHub. But in most cases, if you're not doing anything that's top secret, or if you're not developing technology that is completely brand new, then having a public repository is not such a big problem. And on the other hand as well, you can see loads of other people's public repositories, and you can see, for example, how they structure their code, what is their style, and you can see how people do things. So for example, on GitHub, there are whole repositories on things like Swift Flappy Bird. So it's the entire implementation of Flappy Bird in Swift, and you can run it in your simulator, or you can also look through their code base to see how they did this. So this is the beauty of open source code, and as you develop in your journey of becoming a developer, then you might find that you want to contribute to other open source projects, help them out a bit, and work in a virtual team to try and contribute your knowledge and your programming skills. Okay, so now once I've selected public, the next thing is that I'm going to leave this part empty. I'm not going to initialize a README for my repository just yet. So the next thing is that I'm going to go ahead and click the big green button and create my repository. So now you can see that there are two ways that they tell you can set up your repository. You can either set it up in GitHub for Mac on desktop, their desktop client, which I am not a big fan of, but instead what we're going to do is we're going to use the command line instructions to set up our repository. So we are going to push an existing repository that we've got locally onto this remote repository. And to do that, we need to copy the address of our GitHub repository. And we're going to use these two lines of code in order to transfer or push our existing local repository from the command line. All right, so I'm currently inside my story directory, which also happens to be the working directory for this particular project. And here I am going to, again, take a look at git log to see what previous commits we've got. And you can see that we've got 2 previous commits, and I would like to push both of these commits onto GitHub. So to do that, the first thing is creating a remote. So it's telling my local Git repository that I've created a remote repository somewhere on the internet, and I want to transfer all of my commits over there. So the command that we're going to use is git remote add origin. Now, origin is simply the name of your remote, and you can theoretically call it anything you want. You can call it bacon if you want, but by convention, and it's highly recommended that you simply keep the name origin. And the reason is because most programmers are used to the conventional naming, and that means it'll be much easier for them to understand what's going on in your project when they have a look at it, instead of you doing something completely different, which will be very surprising, and it'll be a lot harder for people to understand what's going on. So git remote add origin, and then we're going to paste the URL of our remote repository on GitHub, and then we're going to go ahead and hit enter. And now that remote is created, so we can push our local repository onto our remote repository, which is called origin. So we're going to say git push -u origin master. And what this line of code does is that it pushes your local repository to the remote repository using the U flag, or the U option, which basically links up your remote and your local repositories. And then we're going to push it towards the remote that's called origin, and we're going to push it to the branch that's called master. So the master branch is simply the default branch, or the main branch of all of your commits. And later on, when we cover branching, then we're going to talk more about what is a master and what is a branch. But for now, we're just saying that we're going to push our local repository onto this origin remote, and we're going to push it to the master branch. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And there's going to be a little bit of work being done in the background, because it's actually going to have to upload your local repository to the remote repository on GitHub servers. And depending on the size of your local repository, this can take various amounts of time. So now, once we see our prompt, so the flashing cursor or the $sign, that means that our push is successful. And as you can see, it says branch master set up to track remote branch master from origin. Sounds really confusing, but if you head back over to GitHub, and if you're on the same page, all you have to do is hit Command R to refresh, or just press the refresh button. And you can see that all of our files are now hosted on GitHub, and it's complete with all of our commit messages. So if you go into Insights, Graphs, and go into Network, you can actually see our master branch, which currently only has 2 save points, or 2 commits. And if you hover over them, you can actually see the commit messages of each of these. So as you build out your project, as you add more commits, either locally or pushing it remotely, or probably doing both, then you can see the progress of your files in your GitHub repository. So now you can see all of the code, if it's code file, or in our case it's just a text file, hosted on GitHub, and you can point anybody towards this. And there are actually cases where people do a lot of story writing using GitHub, just because it's so good at tracking your save points and being able to revert to previous versions in the past. So for example, if you head over back to the main page and you go to your commits, you can see both of those commits, when they were committed, and also if you click on it, you can see the version, you can see the changes that were made at those time points. So if we have a look at chapter 1, you can see this is all we had at the point when we made our first commit. So previously we said that we have a working directory, which is the directory where we initialized Git. Then we can push our files to a staging area where we can pick and choose which files we want to commit. Then once we're ready, then we can commit our files, or our save point, to our local repository. So once you've done a few commits, then you actually have this timeline of various commits. And this is called your master branch. So the master branch is your main branch of commit or save points, and it is sequential, and this is usually where your main progress is saved or committed. Now later on, we then introduced this idea of the remote repository. The important thing to note is that you can have a local repository completely in parallel with a remote repository. Check the differences between them, but you can also sync them so that they are the same. But you can also sync them or push things from your local repository to your remote repository. So in our case, the local repository is the Git file that we've got inside our story directory, and the remote repository is the Git directory that we've got inside our story directory. And the remote repository is GitHub, which hosts our code and also hosts all of the changes that were made in between the different commits. So we have this master branch of various commits, first commit, second commit, third commit, in our local Git repository. And when we performed the command git push, then that effectively pushed all of those commits, all of those various versions and changes and code pieces to our remote repository on GitHub. So that's what git push does. Now in the next lesson, I want to talk about using git ignore and how you can avoid uploading sensitive pieces of information such as API keys or passwords to your remote repositories, for example, GitHub. So all of that and more on the next lesson. See you there.